Hey guys, welcome to Japanese Lesson 6. Today is going to be the first video that covers basically grammar. It's gonna be a relatively short video, at least that's the plan anyways, and we're gonna cover 3 grammatical patterns. The first one is how to say X is Y, or alternatively X is not Y. The second grammar pattern is going to be noun modifications, and the third grammar pattern is going to be the Japanese particle mo, which means also. So we actually did this in a previous video, if you remember, when we were trying to introduce ourselves and our name was something along the lines of Joji Washington. The introduction went a little something like Watashi wa Joji Washington desu. And this is basically a good sentence to exemplify the X is Y grammar pattern, because it's basically saying I am my name. As a little reiteration, I do have to point out that the particle wa again is not the same thing as the English is. It simply marks the topic. So in the form X is Y, with the use of the wa there, it's basically declaring the X as the topic. So the exact translation of the grammar pattern is more something along the lines of as for X, it is Y. We'll make the last example a little more complicated. We can say, あの方は私たちの日本語先生です. And that basically says that person is our Japanese teacher. A quick word-by-word translation. あの方 is a formal way to say that person. 私たち means we, but when a no precedes it, it turns it into a kind of possessive R, and that's what we'll cover in the second grammar pattern. And Nihongo no sensei is Japanese teacher, which again we're about to cover in the second grammatical pattern. Now, what if you want to say that X is not Y? Well, this is our introduction into the fine line in Japanese between formal and informal grammar. From here on out, pretty much every type of conjugation that we do for verbs, there's going to be a formal version to do it and a informal way to do it, and it's going to be really tedious. At least it was for me when I first went about them, but it's a really interesting dynamic that it has. Although it is kind of more work to do, you might just end up appreciating the aspect of the Japanese language like that. We might do a video in the future just giving a brief foreground to the concept of politeness in the Japanese language and how it's ingrained in just about everything. But for now, I'm just gonna present this duality point blank, and we can see if we want to delve into the context of it sooner or not later. So if we want to say X is not Y, we are going to use the same parts of the sentence that we had earlier, and it's going to be Watashi wa Joji Washington de wa arimasen. You'll notice again that we have watashi, we have wa, and we have Joji Washington. And this negative form of saying X is not Y is a good example of how and why the particle wa doesn't mean is, because it still shows up when you're saying is not. So this is basically a repeat of what I said earlier, but the wa here is signaling watashi as the topic of the sentence, and what we're saying about the topic still relates to the name Joji Washington. Instead, this time we're saying it's not Joji Washington, but that still means that we have to say the actual word. And right now it's kind of hard to me to explain the even littler parts of that last part of the sentence and what they each mean, but when we cruise on into the lessons, hopefully you'll notice that there is familiar conjugations in these like verbs and these sentences that you'll make the connection. For now, all I can tell you is what the negative part of this sentence is basically the masen. The de wa is what we use for nouns when we're describing them as in the negative form. You'll see the masen appear when we start covering negative forms of verbs too. And yeah, hopefully that's a good enough tidbit of information just to get you going. There is also a less formal version of this, and it is, instead of de wa arimasen, we use ja arimasen. And even though that is the less formal version, it is by far not the most formal version. We can get a lot more informal and we could actually do the same for the positive part of in which we did watashi wa Joji Washington desu. We could do some alterations to the desu at the end to make it informal as well. We'll see how we're gonna go about covering that in later videos. So we'll move on to the second grammar pattern now, which is noun modification. In the Japanese language, the particle no is what is commonly used for noun modification. And what is noun modification? Well, it's something to basically describe a noun to a further degree than its own pure definition. It can also express a possessive quality and other aspects. In our aforementioned example, we had Nihongo no sensei, and Nihongo is Japanese and sensei is teacher, and basically what the no particle does there is combining those two to kind of directly mean teacher of Japanese, but it could also be really casually, not casually, but just implicitly interpreted as Japanese teacher. In English, Japanese teacher and teacher of Japanese kind of have a distinction of formal tone in them, but in Japanese the no particle is kind of encompassing of both of these. If we want to use it in a possessive sense, we could say something like watashi no hon, which basically means my book. Again, if we want to interpret it as using the of article that we know in English, we could also consider it book of mine, but that's again pretty weird, so there's no need to basically try to filter between the two because it encompasses both meanings. It can actually even get more complicated than this. For example, we could describe the student Joji Washington and we could say Ninensei no Joji Washington, and basically what this is saying is George Washington, the second year student. It's kind of hard to correlate that to the English language because usually if we were describing someone as a second year student, we would say maybe who is the second year student or just the second year student, not of the second year George Washington. So there are definitely some subtle nuances in this form and what you may think it to be, but for the most part it's a really easy thing to get used to. So last up for this video, we have the particle mo, and the definition of mo is basically also. It's a very simple thing to understand conceptually, but in its usage there's some cases that are kind of tricky just because it's pretty different from, again, the languages that you might know. So in Japanese, when the predicate of two sentences are identical, we replace the wa that we normally would use with a mo. So if you were gonna say something in English like I am a student, then you say he is a student too. In Japanese, you would basically do the same thing, but it would be more of a direct translation as I am a student, he also student. Because we take out the wa in the second sentence, and this is the thing that most resembles the English is, but isn't quite, like I've said over and over, it kind of just leaves the second sentence with a mo. So let's say that in Japanese, let's say that I am I and the second student that I'm going to mention is George Washington. So watashi wa gakusei desu. Joji Washington mo gakusei desu. And if you couldn't tell already, gakusei means student in Japanese. If you were wondering what the case would be if we added a third person that we wanted to define as a student to someone, we would also use the particle mo in the third sentence instead of wa. Furthermore, we could combine the second and the third sentence into one sentence if we wanted to, but we would still be using the mo particle and it would appear twice, just as the first instance. So if we have a third person and let's just name him George Washington too. So we would say Joji Washington ni mo gakusei desu. And if you didn't realize, ni means two in Japanese. A simple case in which the particle mo appears is when you want to say something along the lines of just me too. So if someone were to say in Japanese, watashi wa Disneylando ni ikitai desu, and basically what that means is I want to go to Disneyland, a second person could come along using the mo particle and saying me too just by saying watashi mo. And it's a very simple translation, just like English, you only have two words, me too. Basically in Japanese it's me also, or you can perceive mo as meaning two in that case and it'd be fine. So that's the end of the 3 grammar patterns we're gonna cover today. But yeah, stick around and hopefully we're gonna be going places, yo.